Is your practice tired of wrestling with insurance denials, deciphering EOBs, and watching your revenue slip through the cracks? You are not alone. Welcome to The Claim Game, the podcast designed to cut through the confusion and provide you with the best practices for revenue cycle management success. We are Jeremy and Catherine Zug, and we've been with people just like you in the trenches. Each week, we'll break down complex billing processes, share real-world solutions from practices like yours, and ask questions of the game makers and changers of healthcare so you can take control of your revenue. Let's turn those claim denials into deposits and help you return to focusing on patient care. It's time to win the claim game.
Hey everyone, welcome back to the Claim Game podcast. I'm your host, Jeremy Zug. If you're new here, this is the podcast where we take you through the incredibly complex, often frustrating world of revenue cycle management, or RCM. And we turn it into a game we can actually win. We're not just pushing paper, we're navigating a board, avoiding traps, and collecting the resources you need to keep your practice or agency thriving. If you've been with us this whole season, you know how we are systemically working through our way across the revenue cycle management game board. If you need a review of that, you can see episode 1 that does a full overview of what the claim game is about and each domain of revenue cycle management. We're breaking down these 6 domains into winnable territories. Last time we were here, last episode, we covered the first 2 steps of the eligibility and benefits territory, organizing your contacts and running the core eligibility and benefit check. We talked about building your game manual or collecting your insurance contacts. If you missed that, you can hit pause here, go back to episode 23 and give it a listen. It's the foundation for what we're going to be talking about today. Today, however, we're going to be stepping onto a square that I know gives a lot of you like anticipatory anxiety almost, and or nightmares, I suppose. And if in fact, if RCM was a video game, this would be like the boss level, I suppose, for the eligibility domain. We're talking about step 2B, which is prior authorization. This is a controversial one, and I think today's episode will talk a little bit about that controversy and where we land and where we see this process going. This square on the board, or this part of the process, is like a gatekeeper of revenue. You know, you've got on the board, you're in your practice, you're ready to treat a patient, and suddenly there's this giant locked door standing between you and getting paid. And unlike other doors, this one requires a specific key turned at a specific time by a specific person. So if you miss this step, the game doesn't pause. You can't go back. Like, don't pass go, don't collect $200. This one is, if you miss this one, you don't get paid. It penalizes you. Like, if you miss the step and you do the work, you treat the client, and then you get paid $0. That is how important this particular step of the process is. So today we're going to find the key. We're going to break down exactly what a prior authorization is and explore the peer-to-peer review trap, debunk the myth of the retro auth. This one gets a lot of practices, and so hopefully we can do some good work here. And we're going to dive into the massive national debate about what's happening right now and whether this process is broken beyond repair. So grab a hot beverage and a notebook, and let's dive in and see what we can do about prior authorizations. All right, let's get into the mechanics. We're really deep into eligibility and benefits and that process and what that takes and looks like. You've run your E&B check like we taught you last time, and you see the dreaded little flag, right? Let's say you've run your E&B check, you get to the authorization box, and it says authorization is required. What does that mean? Like, what is a prior authorization? And in the simplest of terms, it's a permission slip. It's an additional approval from the insurance company that says, yes, the service is covered and it might be medically necessary, and we agree to pay for it, but you have to get approval before you actually complete the service. And now that sounds like a simple, like, can I reach my hand into the cookie jar and get a cookie? But it's not quite that simple. And here's why this process can feel like a puzzle. Every payer in the country has different rules. Some need it for everything. Some need it for a specific CPT code. Maybe like a really common one is psychological testing, right? Or some sort of lab work can require prior authorization. Some only need it for a certain number of services. Who knows, right? So there's a whole bunch of ways the insurance company pulls the prior authorization lever. And it's important that you know before you treat a client that you need to know whether a prior authorization is required. So here are the stakes, right? Here's what you risk. If you provide the care without that permission slip, the claim's denied. And let's be clear, these are like hard denials to reverse. They're some of the hardest to reverse, and oftentimes you can't reverse them. You can't unring that bell, can't get that time back, and you can't untreat the client so that you go back and do this to get paid. You just miss out, and that's really unfortunate. So, or it can be really fortunate if you have a good process. If you have a clean process, clear expectations, and experienced team, you can tackle this and not have it be quite the burden that it has been in the past. So there are 3 distinct hurdles we have to jump in order to successfully navigate the prior authorization process. The first hurdle is identification. You have to know before the patient walks in the door if an authorization is required. This is where your front desk or intake coordinator is your first line of defense. Sometimes you know because a patient brings in a referral, maybe from a PCP, but a referral is not a prior authorization. We got to be really clear about that. If they don't have a referral and they need one, they have to go back to their PCP to get a referral before a prior authorization. You can see how this gets really murky. So here's a pro tip. Don't rely on the patient to know whether or not they need a referral to qualify for a prior authorization or if the service they're coming to your office for requires a prior authorization. Patients often don't understand their own benefits, and that is unfortunate. In a perfect world, both the patient and the practice would have to know what the patient benefits are, come together and treat the client for what they need. But because patients often don't know, stuff is often as confusing for them as it is for you. We ask and recommend that you shoulder the responsibility to check the portal, call the payer, and see if a specific CPT code requires an authorization. Your revenue really depends on it. So that's an important part of this process. So that's hurdle 1, identification. Let's find out if we need one. 2, hurdle 2, the request and medical necessity. Now, this is the paperwork part. You're submitting a request to the payer. Now, usually you're sending patient demographics and provider info, but the most critical piece and the piece where people fall is justification for medical necessity. You can't just say the patient has a general issue. That's not really enough. You need to speak the payer's language that they're looking for. What are the specific symptoms? What are the measurable goals? What is the evidence-based treatment that you're going to use to treat this client? If you're vague here, you could trigger delay or a review or a denial of the prior authorization. If you trigger a delay here, the payer will often send a request for information. They'll ask for notes or treatment plans. They might even want the rendering provider to call and talk with a peer. And while you're scrambling to fax that over, I know it's 2025, almost 2026. And the fact that I just said you fax something over to the insurance company sounds crazy, but it is certainly not. But while you're getting all that together, your patient is waiting, right? Your client is just waiting for this process to finalize. So we can't control what the insurance companies do, but we can certainly control our internal process to make sure this is simpler. Hurdle 3, the outcome and the peer-to-peer trap. Once you submit, you're going to get one of 3 answers. Answer A, the best one, is approval. And this is your golden ticket to go to the chocolate factory. You get an authorization number, and you want to keep all of this information on hand, right? You don't want to write this number down. You need 3 things: the auth number, the expiration date, and you need what was approved specifically. So for example, if you were approved for a certain amount of visits and you go over, the overage is not going to be approved. So you need to make sure that before you go over, there's a check process to make sure that you need to get another one, right? But either way, if you get approved, there's information included in that approval. Answer B is no. Straight up denial. They're not going to approve, they're not going to prior authorize the service for you. And that has its own ball of wax, its own can, I suppose. And so you need to figure out what you're going to do about a denial. Or answer C, third answer, is that it's a request for information. As I mentioned, you want to answer that immediately, make it as fast and simple as possible. Let's talk about the denial for a second. I think that's the one that causes the most anxiety because it leads to a sub level of the game called the peer-to-peer review. This has happened to you, you know what I'm talking about, but you get a denial saying not medically necessary, you appeal, and then the insurance company says, all right, have your provider call our provider. There are providers that work at the insurance company. And this is a peer-to-peer review. It's a scheduled phone call where you, the rendering provider, have to get on the phone with a provider that works at the insurance company to argue your case. You're going to sink a ton of time here. It can take 30 minutes to an hour out of your clinical day. And often the peer on the other end of the phone isn't even a specialist in your field. Might be a generalist, might be a chiropractor reviewing a complex case for an oncologist. I know that sounds wild, but that is actually how it works. And here's my advice. You want to avoid the peer-to-peer by making your initial request as bulletproof as you can. You want to over-communicate medical necessity in that first submission, so there's no room for doubt. Now I want to zoom out for a second. We've talked about the how-to of the process, but we have to talk about the why. Because if you're feeling frustrated by this process, you're really not alone. In fact, you're part of a massive national conversation right now around prior authorization. And this process has come under fire. On one side, you have providers, people like you, who argue that this process is a massive barrier to care. And the data backs you up in some sense. The American Medical Association reports that physicians and their staff spend an average of 13 hours a week completing prior authorizations. So that's almost 2 full work days for one staff member just asking Papa Payer to reach into the cookie jar to get a cookie, right? Now, I know that's simplistic, but that is essentially what's going on. So critics, and sometimes I tend to agree with these folks, argue that it delays medically necessary treatment. So in the mental health space, for example, a delay of 3 to 7 days for an approval could be critical for surgery, for elective treatment. It can be really hard, and it could be the difference between a patient staying stable, or entering a crisis. All right, so that's one side of the discussion. On the other side, you have the payers. And to play devil's advocate, because we have to understand all the sides of the players to win this game, their argument is cost containment. They argue that the prior authorization process prevents unnecessary procedures, fraud, and waste. They say we have to make sure this patient is receiving evidence-based care and not just expensive experimental treatments. So that's the constant battle, right? Patient access versus cost containment. And here's where this gets really interesting and the landscape is shifting. Have you heard the term gold carding? And this is a really interesting phrase or term, idea. This is a legislative trend that's gaining some traction in states like Texas and is being discussed federally. The idea is pretty simple. If a provider has a high approval rate, let's say 90% of your prior auths are approved over a 6-month period, you could earn something called a gold card. And the gold card would exempt you from prior authorization requirements for those services. It's like a TSA pre-check for the services you provide. And the idea is you've proven you know the rules, you're a good provider, you get good results, good treatment outcomes, so you get to bypass the gatekeeper because you're a proven entity, right? And this is a future that we're starting to see evolve. It rewards good documentation, honest business practices, and reduces administrative waste. And this is I don't know if this is appropriate to say in a podcast, but this is a pretty big but. Until all those laws pass and are implemented federally, you're sort of stuck in this middle ground, right? You can't wait for the gold card. You have to win the game as it's played today. And that means building an effective internal process to navigate the maze that you're in right now. And if you fight the system by ignoring it, you either lose revenue or you have to pivot your practice to make some amount of financial sense. And if you master the system, you protect your practice and your patients. If these are services you want to provide and work with the insurance companies. I will say one small thing about the insurance company's position in this debate. While cost containment is tough, there was an experiment done in 2023 in South Carolina, And they eliminated the prior authorization for certain mental and behavioral health services. And it ended up being a massive failure because what happened was the market flooded with a bunch of bad actors. Essentially, a lot of fraud, waste, and abuse happened, and they had to reinstitute the prior authorization process. And so, while that is not a helpful story or supportive mechanism for the folks that say that prior authorization delays and denies care en masse, it is a good example of what the insurance companies will point to say, see, we need some sort of trigger here. And so we're big advocates of the changes that are happening on a policy level, and we hope to see good improvements over 2026 on this process to make sure that patients get the care that they need when they need it for the right duration of time.
Here's the bottom line. Documentation affects your bottom line. Blueprint, the AI assistant for providers, helps you write faster, better notes that keep insurance happy and money flowing for your practice. Check the show notes for the link to give it a try for free.
All right, we're going to move forward and we're going to talk about the myth of the retro authorization. Before we get to the tools that you need to effectively implement a prior authorization process, we want to address a question that gets in our inboxes all the time. It usually goes something like this. It goes, hey, Jeremy, kind of messed up. I saw a patient for five visits, or I did this service, or I did this test. And I just realized, my staff just realized that we forgot to get an authorization. Can you or can our team just call them and get a retro authorization? But we often abbreviate this term, or retroactive authorization, we abbreviate to be retro auth, right? It's not like a 1960s party or document or something. It's just a shortened version for let's go back in time and get approval for the session. And here's the really hard truth about this. The retro auth is almost always a myth. Rare cases does a retro auth get approved. Most payers have a strict policy. No authorization, prior authorization, no payment. If you call 3 weeks later, they're going to say, sorry, the start date for this authorization is today. The previous treatment or the previous services you provided are denied, and we will deny an appeal. Now, are there exceptions to that? Really occasionally, but if you can prove that the patient gave you incorrect insurance info or there was a genuine medical emergency that prevented you from getting the auth, you might, and I really have to stress this, you might be able to fight for a retro auth, but don't build your practice or your business model on hoping for retro auths or waiting around for something like that to get approved. You do not want to rely on that. It's a Hail Mary pass. It works an obscenely small amount of time. And most of the time, you're just going to write off that balance anyway. And remember, you usually cannot bill the patient for that treatment, whatever that was, if the denial is due to your administrative error, which is the failure to get the prior authorization. So you're just going to eat the cost. So the best strategy is pre-authorization, not retro authorization. So now we have to talk about what do I need, Jeremy, to get this stuff done? How do we master this process? Well, you need the right equipment. Right, you wouldn't go on a hike without the right equipment. You would take a backpack probably and some food and water and matches and a tent or what have you. So there are two specific tools I recommend for the prior authorization process to be done successfully and to keep your practice moving forward. First, you need a prior authorization checklist. Don't rely on sticky notes on your monitor. I know some of you are doing this, right? Or paper, just like sticky notes or notes everywhere. Your desk is a mess. Don't rely on your memory. You need a dedicated physical or digital checklist that tracks the entire life cycle of an authorization. If you're going to build that yourself, and I know some of you really like to build things yourself. You feel like you need to get your arms around it and give it a big hug and squeeze, and that's totally fine. Here's what you need to know. You need to know the date you submitted the request. You need to know the method of submission, whether that's through a phone portal or, yes, fax. You need a reference number. That's your proof that you asked. The decision, the stipulations around treatment. So is it number of sessions approved? Is it a lab that's approved? Is it testing that's approved? Is it surgery that was approved? Whatever it was, is it approved? The effective date, so the date that the authorization goes into effect, and the expiration date. Sometimes authorizations are good for a year. Sometimes they're good for 2 years. Sometimes they're good for a few months. It You never know. So you need to know when it expires. You use this checklist every single time an auth is required. It ensures you have all the data ready to go on the claim form. Second, go back to the insurance contact reference list. If you don't know what that is, on the last episode, we talk about how you need an insurance contact reference list. And we recommend adding a tab specifically for authorization requirements, because you can start to build the requirements needed for a prior authorization so that you can anticipate when a service needs an authorization and then update that as you need to, right? Because sometimes those stipulations change. So you need to list out your top 5 payers. For each one, answer, do they require an auth for fill in the CPT code? Do they require an auth for testing or lab work? And having this cheat sheet prevents you from having to call every single time, right? These tools turn chaos into efficiency, right? I hope I remember to call is a bad plan, right? Knowing you need to call is a much better plan. All right, so let's wrap this up. Let's take a look at our case study card first. And we want to tell you about a practice that we worked with recently, a really talented group of clinicians. They're great at getting the initial authorization. They follow the rules. They get approved for 10 sessions, and then they would put the auth number in the system. Great, right? But here's where they failed. They didn't track the count of sessions that had been done. And so they had a client, let's call him Mark. That's not actually his name. Mark with severe anxiety. And they were making great progress. Mark was coming in every week and they were doing their thing, but nobody was paying attention. And they blew right past session 10 and they went on, right? Session 10, 11, 12, all the way to 18. And they assumed that because they had the auth number in the system, they were good, right? Somebody will catch it, right? And then suddenly the practice manager gets an EOB with 8 denials. And the reason code was benefit maximum reached. And so they had to scramble, right? And that's when practices turn to us because they go, why are we getting huge spike in denials? Our receivables are going crazy. And they treated the auth as, we found through our work with them, that they were treating authorization as a one-time, one-stop gate and not a meter, as it were, right? Like a parking meter, you have to like keep feeding the meter. So they scrambled to try to get a retro auth for those 8 sessions. The payer said no. They tried to appeal based on medical necessity. The payer said the necessity isn't the issue, the lack of permission is. So they ended up writing off almost $1,200 in revenue. But the worst part wasn't the money. It was the disruption to the client's care, right? They wanted to pause treatment while they sorted out the new authorization. And that's really who suffers in this process, right? So how could this be avoided? Really simple. And you can find trackers called countdown mechanisms. Oftentimes your EHR has one. In your practice, when you hit session 8 out of 10, a flag needs to go up. A red light needs to flash. Something. That's your cue to go back and request more so that necessary services for clients don't get interrupted. And it's really on our shoulders to make sure that that happens. All right, so that's the prior authorization puzzle. It's tricky, it's frustrating, and yes, the system is really flawed, but it can be really winnable. So here's what I want to recap today. Your strategy for today: identify early. Know if you need a prior authorization. Get that permission slip before the patient arrives. So use the intake call to find out and make sure your eligibility and benefit process is clear enough to be able to handle that. Over communicate necessity. That's number 2. When you request, use the payer's language and avoid the request for information loop. 3, track the count. Don't just get the authorization, monitor it. Build a countdown so you know when to ask for more before you run out. And number 4, don't bank on retro auths. Just let's get this right the first time so that there's no interruption in care. If you need help building that system, both the prior authorization checklist and the insurance contact reference list are available right now in our online learning hub, the Hourglass. Check out the link in the show notes. And the next time on the Claim Game, we're going to be moving to steps 3 and 4 of eligibility and benefits, updating accumulations and communicating with your patients. We're going to be talking about how to have those money conversations, telling a patient what they owe without feeling awkward or salesy. You won't want to miss it. And until then, keep up the good work. Thank you for everything you're doing, and thank you for letting me be part of your day today. We'll see you next time. Thank you. If you enjoyed today's episode of The Claim Game, please take a moment to leave us a rating and review wherever you listen to your podcasts. It really helps new listeners to find us. Make sure you never miss an episode by subscribing to The Claim Game on your favorite podcast app. Your feedback means so much to us. We want to provide valuable education about revenue cycle management. So if there's something we didn't cover in our topic that was a burning question for you, please let us know so we can try to get you the information you desire. You can find the links to all resources we mentioned in this episode in the show notes. And if you want to dive deeper into our resources, we have 2 places you can do that. First, you can go to our blog at practicesol.com/blog, where we have 8 years of educational blogs. If you want to learn more about what Practice Solutions does, reach out. We'd love to hear from you. Just go to practicesol.com to learn more and to connect with one of our awesome people on our team. Thanks for listening. We are Jeremy and Catherine Zug, and this is The Claim Game. See you at the game table next time.